A young woman falls to her death from a rugged California cliff. Months after she's buried, an investigator suspects she was pushed. Researchers try to determine a woman's cause of death 3,000 years after she died. How can they perform an autopsy without destroying her fragile, mummified shell? To catch a murderer, detectives must prove that a few splinters of bone are the remains of a woman who disappeared 2 years earlier. Time doesn't heal all wounds, a fact that keeps relentless detectives on the trail of cold or forgotten cases. With cutting-edge technology, forensic experts are able to travel back in time, months, years, or millennia, to coax mysteries out of the grave. From San Diego to San Francisco, California's coastal highways are some of the most magnificent drives in the world. Heading north, stretches of glittering sand and crowded freeways gradually give way to a vastly different landscape. As Highway 1 winds through the Monterey Peninsula, mountains collide with the sea in a majestic alliance of power and beauty. In Big Sur, California, the huge sky and boundless Pacific Ocean seduce visitors to the edge of the dizzying cliffs for a breathtaking view of the edge of the world and a snapshot by which to remember it. But sometimes the pull is too strong. On April 2nd, 1987, the Monterey County Sheriff's Department received a phone call that something horrible had happened at the Seal Beach Overlook. The body of a 20-year-old woman named Dina Hubbard Wild was lying near the base of a 600-foot precipice. It was not the first time the search and rescue squad had been dispatched to collect the remains of a victim lured too close to the edge. A deputy from the sheriff's office questioned the middle-aged couple waiting at the scene. They were Virginia and B.J. McGinnis, tourists from San Diego. They told the officer that their young companion had tumbled over silently when they weren't looking. The rescue squad retrieved the lifeless body from the bottom of the cliff. After a cursory examination by the coroner, Dina Wild was returned to her hometown of Louisville, Kentucky, and buried. At the Second Presbyterian Church in Louisville, Dina Wild's freak accident was still on people's minds months after she'd been buried. When services ended one Sunday, Dina's mother, Bobby Roberts, approached a lawyer named Steve Keeney. She needed help collecting insurance money after her daughter's death.
She wanted to collect burial insurance that she had as part of her benefits as a teacher, and the insurance company had told her no. We told her that sometimes a letter from a law firm cuts through the red tape, we'd give it a try.
Keeney knew that Bobby could really use the $3,500. He agreed to make a few phone calls for her on his own time. Keeney called Bobby's insurance company and uncovered the source of the holdup. They had never received Dina's death certificate. Keeney then called the Monterey coroner's office requesting a copy of the death certificate. But when the document arrived, it listed the cause of death as pending. Because Dina's death was presumed to be an accident, the rescue team had done little beyond retrieving the body. No evidence was collected, no photographs were taken. The body was sent to the Monterey coroner's office. Its analysis found no hint of foul play. Bobby Roberts' simple request was snowballing into a time-consuming tangle of bureaucracy. But Keeney pressed on. He contacted Monterey law enforcement only to discover that the case was in limbo. The certificate couldn't be issued until cause of death was determined, but the sheriff's department had, for all intents and purposes, dropped the case for lack of evidence. Dina had been dead for months. What could be holding things up? Keeney called Bobby's insurance company again to see if there was some way of expediting Bobby's payment.
When we called back, we stumbled into a fact that we never expected. That was that there was life insurance on Dina in someone else's name, and they had made a claim for that policy.
The amount that you're looking for is $35,000?
That claimant was none other than Virginia McGinnis, the woman with whom Dina had spent her final hours. Just a day before Dina's death, Virginia had taken a $35,000 policy out on the young woman. The day after Dina's death, she had tried to cash in. In Keeney's mind, Dina's accidental tumble was swiftly transforming into something more sinister. But without a witness or a body, how could he distinguish between a tragic fall and a push?
Ask yourself, how do you prove someone was pushed off a cliff? Imagine you're standing at the edge of the cliff and you fall. Think of the injuries. You'll be battered, there'll be broken bones, there'll be bruises on your body will end up at the foot of the cliff. And now put yourself back at the cliff and imagine you're pushed. Same thing, right? Same bruises, same broken bones. Well, not quite.
The suspicion that Dina may have been shoved over the edge was a chilling hypothesis, but it was still just speculation. To prove any wrongdoing, Keeney needed evidence. He went back to basics, trying to learn more about Dina's relationship with the older couple. Virginia and B.J. McGinnis, the parents of one of Dina's friends, had taken her into their San Diego home after she was separated from her husband. Dina's loneliness was relieved in the fun-filled months she'd spent with her surrogate parents. She was known for her blind devotion to new friends. Had she been duped by the McGinnis' kindness? To check his suspicions, Keeney secured a copy of the autopsy report from the Monterey coroner's office. In the report, he noticed something unusual. A blood test revealed the presence of a drug called amitriptyline, commonly known as Elavil. The antidepressant had never been prescribed to Dina. It had, however, been prescribed to Virginia's husband, B.J. Toxicologist Catherine Ham retested a vial of Dina's blood that had been frozen after her autopsy. Her job was to check for levels of the drug. Keeney hoped that if a crime was committed, it could be proven in the lab.
I think that a lot of people that commit crimes underestimate what we can do in the laboratory.
To test for the presence of chemicals in the blood, Ham adds a solvent into the sample. The tube is rocked for 20 minutes as the drugs move out of the blood and into the solvent. The solvent is then removed from the tube and evaporated. The reconstituted solvent is injected into a gas chromatograph, an instrument that separates compounds according to their chemical properties. Ham compared the standard for the drug and the products of its breakdown with the chromatograph of Dina's blood. They matched. Having been frozen for so long, Dina's blood was degraded. Ham was unable to determine exactly when Dina had taken the drug, or exactly how much she'd taken. What she did know was that Dina Wild had Elavil in her system when she died. With its disorienting and unpleasant side effects, it was hardly the kind of medication that Dina might have popped for a quick buzz. People taking the drug are usually stricken with weakness, nausea, and dizziness. These symptoms would be more pronounced in individuals who, like Dina, didn't take the medication on a regular basis. As he learned about Elavil's effects, Keeney realized that he needed to revise his image of Dina's last moments of life. If she'd been as queasy and unsteady as Ham suggested, she most likely would have slid down the mountain, not plunged. Though no crime scene photos had been taken, the period of time before the fall was well documented. Virginia had sent Dina's mother the roll of snapshots from the day of the accident as a gesture of condolence. Could these posed snapshots tell Keeney about the cause of Dina's death? At first glance, the 15 chronological pictures told the story of an average sightseeing junket. Dina seemed comfortable and happy as she posed for the camera. But as Keeney studied the pictures more carefully, he suspected that he was witnessing a murder plot.
The photograph of Virginia and B.J. McGinnis walking away from the car was taken by Dina Wild, and it is a signature photo. It's at the cliff where she would die a few minutes later. It's when the Elavil has kicked in and she knows something's wrong. She's leaving a note to the rest of us that will survive her. It's like an assault victim who takes their own blood and writes the name of their assailant. She's pointing the finger.
The Elavil had clearly taken effect in the subsequent picture. Dina's bright eyes had grown dull. Her features slackened. She seemed unable to stand on her own.
That's great. 1, 2, 3.
When Keeney got to picture 11, the first thing that came to his mind was Dina knows. What at first seemed an innocuous cliffside stroll revealed upon closer examination the terrifying moment before Dina's death.
At that lip, you can see Dina's shoes pointing toward the boulders, in toward the road, but you can see her head in a blur, turning as she realizes her body is getting pushed that way. And as she looks, like you would if you were pushed, as she looks where she's going, the photo blurs. There are no features of her face at all. But her shoes still point to BJ, the guy she trusted.
Moments later, she would be dead. To Keeney's way of thinking, the bizarre and disturbing circumstances of Dina's death were leading to a single conclusion.
Once you know a 20-year-old dies with 55-year-old strangers at her side, and you know that those strangers bought a life insurance policy on her, in your heart, don't you believe that that's almost bound to be a murder?
Armed only with a handful of photos and a hunch, Keeney was a long way from proving murder. He knew he would need some help. In Louisville, Kentucky, Steve Keeney revisited Dina Wild's autopsy report, looking for a shred of evidence to support his murder hypothesis. The Monterey coroner had determined the cause of Dina's death to be a skull fracture. He surmised that she lost her footing because of her high-heeled shoes. In his opinion, there was nothing suspicious about the circumstances of the so-called accident. Keeney wasn't so sure. He wondered if there was anything in the coroner's slim findings that suggested otherwise. Keeney brought the autopsy photos to forensic pathologist Barbara Weekly-Jones. Could her analysis of the pictures differentiate a murder from an accident?
Steve Keeney was surprised when I told him some of the injuries were suggestive of not just an accidental death. Describe any on one hand.
The only fatal injury on Dina's body was a blow to the head, yet the right side of her body had linear scrape marks. To Weekly-Jones, those lacerations suggested a limp slide, not a head-first plummet. Dina's bruised hands provided the most telling physical evidence. They hadn't sustained the kinds of injury typical in a fall. Her acrylic nails were snapped off, ragged, and embedded with granite, suggesting she'd clawed at the edge of the cliff, trying to save her life. Or perhaps she'd fought before she plunged to her death. In addition to the torn nails, both hands were marred by a very suspicious wound pattern.
But they had huge hematomas, black and blues, on the tops around her knuckles. Those you get when somebody steps on your hand, if you're holding the edge of a cliff.
Keeney wondered if Dina's broken skull was the result or the cause of her terrible fall. The top of the cliff sloped gently for the first few yards. If Dina had been trying to save herself, she no doubt would have grabbed at a rock or a tree root. But her palms showed no injuries, no signs of clutching at anything.
And look, she had fingernails. It looks like artificial fingernails.
Weekly-Jones's findings substantiated Keeney's theory of an intentional push and a limp slide.
But that's not proof of homicide. So what else do you do? Well, the old phrase is, circumstances don't lie, people do.
There you go.
Keeney needed to
Did you
take
see
a
any
close
whales?
look at the suspects, Virginia and B.J. McGinnis.
Yeah. Well, they come up
Had
and
this
down
pleasant,
from
middle-aged
Mexico
couple
from
really
October
plotted to
to
do away with Dina?
February.
Were they truly capable of pushing their young friend off a 600-foot cliff?
Yeah, they spawn. That's what they do. That's
As
a
he
good
probed
word
the
for it.
backgrounds of his prime
Spawning.
suspects, Keeney uncovered a trail of death and deception. Virginia's rap sheet was a lot bloodier than Keeney had anticipated. Though the former nurse could affect a saccharine persona, her past suggested a cold, psychopathic profile that included compulsive lying, arson, and cruelty to animals. In addition to the accidental deaths of her daughter and second husband, Virginia's parents and several of her patients had died of unknown causes while in her charge. She frequently benefited from their life insurance policies. Keeney compiled this information into a lengthy report. It wasn't enough evidence to arrest Virginia and B.J. McGinnis, but it was enough to get the case reopened in California. Because the McGinnises had purchased Dina's insurance policy in San Diego, the district attorney's office in that jurisdiction became involved. Investigator Scott Lawrence took the baton from Steve Keeney. Like the Louisville attorney, he was compelled to make sense of Dina's fall. But Dina's case didn't have the benefit of much physical evidence. Lawrence attempted to disprove the theory of an accidental tumble by recreating Dina's trajectory. It was more than a year and a half after Dina's death, so any blood or geographic disturbance from her fall would have been washed away. The only thing Lawrence knew for sure was where she landed. What he needed to determine was where the fall started.
Well, one of the things that we had to look into was where we knew she was last standing at this turnout, almost within a few feet of where I'm at. That's based upon testimonial evidence as well as photographic.
Based on Lawrence's assessment, this wasn't a place where a person was likely to lose her footing, even in high-heeled shoes. The ground was relatively flat and solid. Now, Lawrence could recreate Dina's path down the cliff. Though he was a novice rock climber, his fierce commitment to the truth compelled him down the cliff face with a video camera in hand. From his topographic analysis, Lawrence believed that Dina was dead or near death when she lost her grip on the edge of the overlook. For one thing, the first section of the cliffside was not a sheer drop. Had Dina accidentally fallen here, she probably would have been able to stop her descent. She probably would have screamed. After the initial slope, the cliff drops off suddenly. Lawrence experimented to see how fast and by which route Dina was likely to have descended.
So we could take individual rocks and toss them down, and you get a pretty good idea of how you would accelerate once you got past the incline and once you made that first precipice about 40 or 50 feet down to my right, down toward the ocean.
Had Dina free-fallen off the precipice, she would have hit the bottom in excess of 120 miles per hour. Yet her body was in one piece, with no tumbling marks and relatively few fractures. Lawrence's research corroborated Weekly Jones's analysis of the body. Dina went down the cliff in a slow, limp slide, not an accelerating, high-speed tumble. Lawrence's careful recreation of the fall didn't jibe with the story relayed by the McGinnises.
So we tried many ways to interpret what could have happened, and the bottom line is there's always unknowns, and the people that know aren't talking.
By September of 1989, police gathered enough incriminating evidence to arrest the McGinnises. For the trial, the cliffside overlook was transformed into an outdoor courtroom. Scott Lawrence's careful recreation had a profound impact on the jury. The odyssey begun in Steve Keeney's office ended when the jury found Virginia McGinnis guilty of conspiracy, first-degree murder, insurance fraud, forgery, and murder for financial gain. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. B.J. McGinnis had died of pneumonia before the trial began. The inconsistencies in the so-called accidental death of Dina Hubbard Wild had been untangled to reveal a cold-blooded murder, despite the fact that neither the body nor the crime scene had been preserved. For experts hoping to solve old murders, keen analysis of the meager traces left behind means the difference between overdue justice and a death that is forever lost in time. For 7 years, Susan Davis endured an unsatisfying marriage with a struggling insurance salesman named Ralph. Leaving was always on her mind, but she never got very far from their Columbia, Missouri home. Then, one evening in June 1985, after a long day at her secretarial job, she climbed into her Ford Escort and drove off, never to be seen again. When she failed to show up for work the next day or answer phone calls, her mother contacted the police. Officers from the Boone County Police Department questioned relatives and searched the Davis home, but found nothing to indicate that Susan had been taken against her will.
Yes, I'm so worried.
Some people believed Susan's departure was her way of making a clean break from a life that had gotten too painful and messy. At the time of her disappearance, Susan had finally succeeded in making some big changes. She'd separated from Ralph and sent her 2 children, Robbie and Angela, to live with her parents in Iowa.
And what was his occupation?
Perhaps she was starting her life over in some other part of the country. Captain Larry McCrae led the investigation.
Ralph Davis told us that when Susan disappeared that she had a boyfriend and she'd probably gone off to Texas and someday she'd show back up.
Susan was officially declared a missing person. In her absence, Ralph moved back into the house, brought his children home from their grandparents, and settled into the life of a single father. The family waited in vain for Susan's return. As his finances dwindled, Ralph went to court to make sure that if Susan did resurface, she'd be compelled to pay him child support. But there were still no clues as to her whereabouts and diminishing hope that she'd ever return. But as McCrae came to realize, Ralph Davis's victimized spouse routine was a feeble charade. The more he probed police files, the more McCrae came to realize what an abusive husband Ralph had been. For the duration of their marriage, Susan had lived in the wake of Ralph's ferocity. Then, one night in 1985, a few months before her disappearance, she'd reached the breaking point. Fearing for her life and the safety of her children, she garnered the strength to call the police. Ralph was arrested.
We investigated a case where Ralph had beat her up. We'd photographed, and at that time, there was an ex parte on her, which says, Ralph, you cannot go back to your home. You have to stay away from Susan and the kids.
A short stay in jail did little to calm Ralph. He had been boiling mad when he was released on bail. Then Susan disappeared. Ralph's violent tendencies gave credence to the theory that Susan had left him and covered her trail to ensure her safety. But for McCrae, the pieces still weren't adding up. Why hadn't this devoted mother contacted her children? Why hadn't she checked in with her frantic mother to let her know that she was all right? McCrae suspected he was looking at something more ominous than a woman in search of a happier life. McCrae believed that Ralph Davis wasn't telling the whole story. But without any evidence, the police had no course of action. There was no body. There were no leads. Even Susan's car had disappeared. McCrae's only option was to dig in and hope that one day a clue would surface. He didn't imagine that the waiting game would play out for so long. It had been 2 years since Susan Davis climbed into her car and vanished. Whether she left town intentionally or met a horrible fate remained an unanswered question. Captain McCrae's investigation met a dead end. Then one day, the owner of a storage facility took the locks off a unit rented by a customer who'd stopped paying his bills. Inside was a Ford Escort with the driver's side window blown in. The name of the delinquent customer was none other than Ralph Davis.
That's McCrae.
Captain McCrae was contacted. A quick run of the vehicle ID and tags confirmed it was Davis's car. McCrae took a look inside and was struck with a terrible sight.
When we approach the car and we look inside of it, we're pretty sure that somebody died in that car.
Blood and tissue spattered the dashboard, seats, and visors. Glass shards mingled with spent bullet shells on the car floor. 2 feeble air fresheners added a grim irony to the grisly scene. After 2 years of sitting on his hands, McCrae could finally move in on his prime suspect, Ralph Davis. Davis came up with a story to explain away the car. Before blowing out of town, he said, Susan had paid him one last visit. She was armed. Ralph overpowered her, pulled her out of the car, and climbed behind the wheel. As he drove away, he claimed, Susan smashed the window with her arm, bloodying the glass. The implausible account did little to explain how bits of body tissue got into the car. Davis was arrested. Experience told McCrae that he'd just detained a brutal murderer, but proving that in court would be another matter, especially when the crime scene was 2 years old. A successful forensic investigation would take a two-pronged approach. First, McCrae's team would have to establish that a murder had in fact taken place in the car, and secondly, they'd have to identify the victim. McCrae believed he was looking at the remains of Susan Davis, but he was a long way from proving it. From the pattern of blood in the car, preliminary crime scene reconstruction determined that the victim had been shot inside the vehicle.
On the floor of the car, we found glass, basically moving inward, which would indicate that a shot or something had gone through that and from the outside. As we looked at the glass, we found that the glass was on the floorboard, and on top of the glass was blood.
It seemed that the shot came through the window, striking the driver in the head. The force sent the victim toward the other side of the car, crashing first into the rearview mirror hard enough to crack the windshield. From the amount of blood and brain tissue found in the car, the medical examiner determined that someone had died here. The automobile was towed to a private storage lot where McCrae's team could try to make sense of the disarray. Because they didn't know what was evidence, they erred on the side of caution and collected everything.
Do you see, is there something back over, see back over?
Armed with specialized tools, apparel, and collection bottles, the investigators began to take the car apart, piece by piece, carefully cataloging each fragment of bone, tissue, and each smear of blood. Bullets were dislodged from the interior of the car. They matched shotgun shells found in Ralph Davis's home. A vacuum with sterile filters was used to collect the tiniest pieces of evidence. Like high-tech car vandals, the team stripped the escort down to the bare bones, bagging everything from the steering wheel to the carpeting for further analysis. At the University of Missouri's Human Skeletal ID Lab, bits of debris, some metal, some glass, some unidentified, were delivered in a matchbox to anthropologist Sam Stout. If human bone fragments were present in the jumbled findings, Stout would know how to unlock their secrets.
My work as an anthropologist was probably important in this case because as anthropologists we're often called upon to analyze bone specimens. We're probably the most familiar with pieces of bone, fragments of bone, whether it be a 2 million year old fossil to a modern cemetery.
33 fragments, none longer than a quarter inch, were separated into little plastic caps.
Bone specimens to embed in plastic and then we'll...
Because the findings were so small, it was nearly impossible to determine by sight whether they were bone. To be sure, Stout needed to examine the samples under a microscope. First, they needed to be prepared for viewing. To make slides, Stout's assistant embeds each fragment in plastic. As the air in the vacuum chamber is drawn away, the plastic impregnates the sample, then hardens. The embedded specimen is cut into slices as thin as cellophane. Each slice is then smoothed and placed on a glass slide for viewing. Microscopic analysis of the cross-sections told Stout that he was, in fact, looking at human bone. Stout knew where the fragments came from, a human skull. Dr. Stout had determined that the meager scrapings from the floor of Susan Davis's car were in fact human facial bones. Now he wanted to see if there was anything unique about the bone fragments that could tie them to Susan Davis and her death. Stout noticed that there were some smudges on the bone fragments. He sent them to the geology department at the University of Missouri lab. A scanning electron microscope revealed that traces of lead had been embedded in the bone. The presence of antimony indicated that gunpowder was involved as well. This victim had been shot. The close scrutiny of these fragments was turning the cloudy details into a vivid portrait of murder. But how could Stout link the bone to Susan Davis? Stout noticed an odd characteristic. Beyond the lead smudges was another lighter discoloration in the bone. In Stout's experience, that pattern indicated that the victim had been taking tetracycline. To test for the antibiotic, he exposed the bone to fluorescent light. If the drug were present, the bone would glow.
We saw the actual fluorescing of tetracycline, and upon seeing that, I suggested that they examine the records to see if Susan Davis had a prescription for tetracycline.
Dr. Stout estimated that the victim had been taking the drug for at least 3 months before death. McCrae knew from the original search of Susan's home that she'd been prescribed tetracycline at the time of her death. Stout had shown that the remains in the car were from the face of a person who was taking tetracycline. But McCrae needed irrefutable proof that this was Susan Davis. Without it, Ralph Davis would likely go free.
The missing link was, whose body was it? We all felt that it was Susan, but that's not evidence that you can take to court.
No murderer in the state of Missouri had ever been convicted without a body, so McCrae had a double burden. Before he could prove that Ralph Davis was a killer, he'd have to prove that Susan Davis was the victim. The finishing touches of the investigation would have to be drawn in blood. Could bloodstains link a 2-year-old crime scene to the death of Susan Davis? It was forensic serologist Lori Maloney's job to find out. Carpeting, sun visors, and upholstery from the interior of the car were sent to her at the Missouri State Highway Patrol lab. If she could determine that blood on these items came from Susan Davis, it would be nearly impossible for Ralph Davis to evade prosecution. But, as Maloney knew, irrefutable victim identification is tricky business. She needed to run a series of tests to find out exactly whose blood this was. Above all, she needed to be precise, to check and cross-check her results. Maloney's first task was to swab the samples to make sure that the stains found in the car were truly blood. The test turns green when blood is present. Maloney then needed to confirm that the blood was human. She added human antibody to the samples. When human blood and human antibody come in contact, they react, forming a thin white line. Maloney's results were consistent with McCrae's theory that someone had been killed in the vehicle.
I found on the evidence human blood detected on the carpeting and the seat belt latches. Also, I found human protein on the sun visors.
But how could she prove that the remains had come from Susan Davis? She had no samples of Susan's blood or tissue to compare them with. Paternity tests are commonly used to establish a man's parenthood by comparing his DNA with that of the child and its mother. By applying that standard procedure in a creative new way, a reverse paternity test, Maloney hoped to simulate Susan Davis's genetic profile. Every child gets half his DNA from his mother, half from his father. Subtracting DNA bands that the father and child have in common leaves a barcode representing the mother's genetic signature.
The remaining bands would then be used to compare to the crime scene evidence, and if those were matching to the crime scene evidence, the blood could have originated from the mother, Susan Davis.
Using this procedure, Ralph Davis's DNA pattern was subtracted from his children's. The resulting bands were a close simulation of Susan Davis's genetic fingerprint. This banding pattern matched the samples found on the Ford Escort's carpet. Susan Davis had been killed in her car. The ghostly fingerprint of a woman who'd vanished years earlier was returning to solve her murder.
What I think happened to Susan Davis was that she was going to leave this area to some safe haven because of Ralph's harassing her, stalking, and she was packing her car, backed up to the front of the house, loading her clothes in it when Ralph came around the house. She saw Ralph, got in the car, locked it up, and Ralph came up and shot her through the driver's side window.
Thanks to astute forensic analysis and an exacting recreation of the grisly death scene, prosecutors convinced the jury that Ralph Davis had killed his estranged wife in her car. It was a landmark decision in Missouri, one that saw Ralph Davis get the death penalty, even though the whereabouts of his victim is a mystery to this day. In the Susan Davis case, investigators had to revisit a crime that happened 2 years earlier without the benefit of a body. In Canada, investigators faced a similar but even stranger challenge: to determine what killed a woman 3,000 years ago. They had the body, but to touch it would be to destroy it. At the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, a mummy named Jedame-Sank, or Jed, has stood in silent vigil for decades. Her secrets wrapped tightly inside her delicate sarcophagus. Museum visitors and scientists alike are fascinated by her mysterious beauty and eager to know more about how she lived and died. From the elaborate drawings on her cartonnage, the shell of linen and glue in which her mummy is encased, we know only scattered details of her life. Nearly 3,000 years ago, Jed, a musician at the Temple Amun-Re, lived a prosperous life on the east bank of the Nile.
So that she will not want.
Ancient Egyptians celebrated life after death, but it could only be attained if they departed this world in the prescribed fashion. The journey to the land of the gods would be strenuous and dangerous. In order for the soul to survive the trip, the body needed to be strong. Mummification was the answer. A marriage of science and religion, the mummification process followed a strictly detailed procedure that took approximately 10 weeks to complete. After death, the body was cleansed and anointed. A single slit was made in the abdomen. Then the internal organs were removed and preserved in jars. Natron, a powdery drying agent made up of salt and sand, was heaped over the body. In the arid heat of the Egyptian sun, the body would completely desiccate in 40 days. The skin was rubbed with oils and resin to keep it supple. Linen stuffing was inserted in the body cavities to maintain lifelike contours. The corpse was adorned with makeup and funerary jewelry. Then the arduous task of wrapping began. In an effort to know more about these ancient people, many researchers, like pediatrician Peter Lewin, have found themselves compelled to unwrap the mysterious packages.
In the olden days, we would break up this casket, tear off the bandages of the individual inside who's mummified, break up the tissues to examine genetic material, chemistry, and any diseases, and in essence destroy a mummy, which is invaluable to humanity.
Lewin grew up in Egypt and has maintained a lifelong fascination with mummies. Today, in addition to his work at Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children, he is a leading researcher in the field of paleopathology.
Paleopathology is really the study of diseases of ancient man, and that can be done by examining the bodies themselves, and also can be done by the latest use of X-ray technology.
How could Dr. Lewin see into the life of this mummy and learn why she died without desecrating the sanctity of her death? X-ray technology, known as computerized axial tomography, or CT scanning, was the answer to Lewin's dilemma. The machine produces cross-sectional images of the body without touching it. When the slices are stacked together, a three-dimensional image is rendered. Dr. Lewin was assisted by CT technician Stephanie Holoka. Lewin, who pioneered the use of the technique to slice into mummies without using a knife, first scanned Jed in 1978. But the technology was in its infancy, and he was barely able to distinguish the ancient body from the dense packing material. Nearly 20 years later, he was ready to try again. Because the patient was already dead, Holoka didn't need to worry about radiation levels. That freedom enabled her to take numerous pictures at very small increments. She scanned the body in 5mm slices and went to 3mm increments for the head and neck. Even greater detail was used to image the ears and eyes. 300 two-dimensional images were taken during the 4 hours of scanning. Glimpses of Jed came through in these X-rays, but it wouldn't be until they were stacked together that the ancient woman would truly come to life. Once the meticulous scanning was completed, it was finally time for the mummy to show herself. A computer compiled the pictures into a 3D rendering, but the quality was poor. In living patients, bone is dense and shows up white. Fat, flesh, and skin are gray. Liquid is black. In Jed's body, the bones had lost minerals and become softer, while the soft tissue had toughened. Instead of a high-contrast image, Jed was showing up only in shades of gray. This low-contrast problem meant that Holoka would have to painstakingly render the images slice by slice. Imaging the skull in a live patient takes 10 minutes. It took Holoka 3 hours to reconstruct Jed's skull and hundreds of hours to render the entire body. Holoka was then able to electronically peel away the layers. After removing the outermost layer of cartilage, she arrived at the linen wrapping that surrounded the head. Gray circles showed up over the eye sockets. The Egyptians inserted plates behind the lids to keep the features from sinking. Holoka also noticed that in keeping with the ritual, Jed's brain had been removed and her skull stuffed with linen. Finally, the image of a small, young woman appeared. Based on the pattern of bone fusion, Jed was estimated to be 30 to 35 years old when she died.
And the first thing I thought when I saw her skull, after doing a lot of 3D imaging on various skulls, is that she must have been a very pretty lady. She had very high cheekbones and she had a very well-defined chin.
Holoka had used CT technology to excavate the mummy. Now, Lewin wanted to know what killed her Could he determine cause of death 3,000 years after the fact? Lewin examined the 3D image of Jed's skull. He noticed a strange black shape on the left jawbone. The gaping hole, he realized, was an enormous abscess. Hard as it is to believe, Jed had died from dental disease. Ancient Egyptians were prone to dental disease because of their sandy, coarse diet and their love for sweets. In Jed's case, the outer enamel on 24 of her 28 teeth had worn away, exposing the sensitive dental pulp and the root. Exposed roots are acutely painful. They also become infected easily. Jed's infection was spread from the root canal to the bone, where it caused several abscesses. Lewin surmised that the large pus-filled cyst probably burst, spreading infection throughout her body and poisoning her blood. It was probably an agonizingly painful, drawn-out death.
She probably died a very, very miserable death due to genital infection, which originated from this basically dental abscess of her left upper jaw.
In life, this beautiful musician from Thebes endured agonizing pain. In death, thanks to the pioneering efforts of Dr. Lewin's team, she has finally achieved the kind of celebrated and dignified afterlife her culture held so dearly.
With this type of imaging, really, we have pioneered the use of that sort of technology which is non-destructive and which gives us tremendous information in relation to diseases of ancient man.
Because Jedame-Sank had been so carefully preserved, time didn't stand in the way of science. Detectives who lure truth from the murky past are constantly fighting against the ravages of time. Today, science is their greatest ally in that battle. Armed with the latest techniques, forensics experts are winning the war against time, liberating lost and forgotten voices from beyond the grave. In Seattle, police hope a bloody handprint will finger a killer. But the stain is barely visible. Can investigators bring the evidence into focus? A new computer promises to read a killer's mind. Can it really see the truth locked in the murderer's memory? 2 bodies are found in the California wilds. Clues are spotty and scarce. To bring the killer to light, police rely on a new laser technique. When evidence can't be seen with the naked eye, investigators must use extraordinary means to find it. As technology develops to tease out clues, it's providing detectives with an infallible witness. Forensic science is constantly evolving, from the discovery of the uniqueness of the human fingerprint to the ability to match a criminal to his crime through DNA profiling. Technology continues to provide investigators with new weapons. But fingerprint and DNA evidence are discovered in only 1% of all cases. When trusted techniques fail, investigators must turn to cutting-edge technology to bring invisible clues to light. On the clear spring morning of May 14, 1995, in Kirkland, Washington, just outside Seattle, Randy Acall returned from work and noticed that his neighbor's front door was propped open.
Hello?
Ordinarily, he wouldn't have given it much thought.
Hello?
But he had noticed that the door had been open when he had left for work the night before.
Anybody home?
Randy was a little worried and decided to see if everything was all right.
Hello? Hello?
As he entered the bedroom, a gruesome sight greeted his eyes. He found the body of a woman in her 30s lying in a heap at the foot of the bed. Her head was covered in the top bed sheet, and a t-shirt was bunched up around her neck. Blood stained the carpet beneath her. Horrified, Randy dialed 911.
Yes, I'd like to report an emergency.
Detective T.J. Klump of the Kirkland Police responded to the call.
It was Mother's Day, 1995, at about 10:30 a.m. in the morning. I was preparing to take my wife and daughter out for Mother's Day when, just prior to leaving, I received a call from the Kirkland Dispatch Center, and they requested that I immediately contact Sergeant Markle and the Detective Division that there had been a suspicious death that all the detectives were being called in for to investigate.
When the police reached the apartment, they saw no sign of forced entry. At first glance, there were none of the usual indications that a crime had taken place. The TV, the stereo, and other items of value were still in the condominium. Nothing had been disturbed.
Once I arrived there, and after we had obtained the search warrant, we entered the condominium. And the first thing that struck me was how clean it was for a crime scene. It was very clean, immaculate.
The killer seemed to have been meticulous in covering his tracks. Detectives set about trying to uncover what few clues they could. The case hinged on their ability to bring secrets of the crime scene out into the light. A driver's license was found in a denim purse. The murdered woman was identified as Dawn Faring, a student at the Lutheran Bible Institute who had been living at the condominium for several months. Autopsy evidence, including the body's temperature and its state of rigor mortis, indicated that she had been killed within the last 24 hours. Further test results indicated that the victim had been sexually assaulted, but none of the culprit's DNA was found. The detective and his fellow officers carefully collected evidence from the scene, removing the bed sheets and sections of the blood-stained carpet. They hoped these might contain some clue to the killer's identity. They also found cigarette tobacco and ash near the bed. The victim didn't smoke. They were left by the killer, but were of little use. Another scrap turned up that proved more valuable.
While we were searching the condominium for evidence, we found a box of receipts. And Dawn Faring was a very meticulous person. She was very organized. She saved receipts. She had phone logs. And she had saved some receipts, one of which was a receipt from 5/12 of 95. It was during the late evening hours. She had purchased some groceries at a nearby Fred Meyer's store.
To pinpoint Faring's time of death and to determine whom she might have been with, police went to the grocery store listed on the receipt.
Roxanne, I'd like to show you this picture and see if you recognize this young lady.
A clerk remembered helping the victim. Faring had come in near closing time. She had been friendly and in a good mood. and she had left the store by herself. Along with this information and the evidence gathered from the crime scene, investigators began to piece together the victim's final hours. After leaving the store just before 10 p.m. on May 12th, she apparently went straight home and unpacked her groceries. Putting herself through Bible school, Fehring kept track of every penny she spent. She placed her receipt in the box in her hall closet. She then began to bake a pan of brownies, possibly for a Mother's Day celebration the next afternoon. Police estimated it took her an hour to make the brownies. They found them cut and arranged on a plate by the stove. By retracing Fehring's steps, investigators arrived at an estimated time of death. Pinning down the time of death narrowed the killer's window of opportunity. But who killed Dawn Fehring? Careful scrutiny of the crime scene revealed the faint traces of what might have been finger and palm prints on the bed sheets, traces of the murderer preserved in the victim's own blood. But there was no way to dust or lift the prints from the sheet. Detectives needed to somehow make them clear enough to be useful. The evidence was passed on to King County latent laboratory scientist Pat Warwick.
When we opened up the evidence, we could tell there was some kind of body fluid on the sheet, but any discernible detail, any kind of handprint or anything was very, very difficult.
The print was smeared and faint. No one had ever tried to lift a fingerprint from cloth before, and this one promised to be particularly difficult. Warwick believed his best hope might be to process the prints with amido black, a forensic dye that highlights organic proteins such as blood. But amido black was usually used on hard, non-porous surfaces. Its use on fabric could jeopardize this crucial piece of evidence. Warwick called the FBI for help. But they could offer no advice, beyond agreeing that amido black was the best approach. If Warwick used amido black on the sheet fragment, the dye and the rinses in distilled water might well destroy the print. But if the process worked, Warwick would be breaking fresh ground in forensic analysis. Warwick was extremely careful, but it seemed he was not careful enough. When he immersed the fabric in the inky solution, his worst fears were realized. The entire swatch, palm print and all, turned an opaque shade of dark purple. Any hope of getting a legible print seemed lost. In Seattle, authorities investigating the murder of Dawn Fehring feared that the only forensic evidence, a palm print, was ruined. Hoping to find another lead, detectives questioned the victim's neighbors. Was this a crime of opportunity? Or was the killer someone Dawn Fehring knew and trusted enough to let in her door? While the work of the detectives moved forward, there was a glimmer of hope in Pat Warwick's laboratory. He was relieved to see the excess dye begin to rinse away from the palm print. As he hoped, the amido black dyed the bloodstains purple. but it also stained the fabric light blue, making it difficult to discern the palm print from the weave of the fabric. The confusion of the two patterns made a clear analysis next to impossible. Warwick contacted his colleague, Eric Berg, an expert in the field of digital imaging and enhancement at the Tacoma Police Department.
Yeah, I don't know how good it's going to be, but just let me know, and we'll get down here.
Could Berg's computers and high-tech cameras read the bloody palm print and identify the killer?
Piece of sheet here. And some amino black on it. Up in here? There might be something there.
Berg used a digital camera to capture the print. It gave him the flexibility he needed to manipulate and clarify the image. Once he obtained the digital images of the bloody print, he followed strict chain of evidence procedures. The images were tracked with a system that protected them from tampering or accidental alteration.
The software that we use uses the data encryption standard, which is a governmental standard that actually will allow you to mathematically prove that an image or any kind of a digital file has not been altered.
To preserve the original picture, he made copies to work from. Now he was ready to clean up the print. But the image was still in such poor condition, he was not confident he could do much. The ridges of the fingerprint seemed hopelessly tangled with the fabric weave.
Now, at this point, I would put in the source. You could just start to follow a ridge line on the print, and then all of a sudden the weave pattern would come in and disrupt your eye, and you'd go off on a tangent, and you couldn't follow that ridge without constantly being interrupted by the fabric pattern. So the biggest problem was that fabric pattern. We had to find a way to just suppress it or get rid of it somehow, and then look at the print, what was left after that. And if I move my box over here...
Berg used software to filter out the background pattern. While it didn't entirely remove the weave pattern, it managed to blur it, allowing the ridge detail to stand out in clearer relief. But it seemed to Berg that while every step made the image of the bloody print a little clearer, it also created new problems for him to solve. In blurring the fabric pattern, this process significantly reduced the contrast of the image. It remained to be seen whether he could make sense of the print. While Eric Berg struggled to render a clear print, the Kirkland detectives continued to question the victim's neighbors.
I was in a hurry, I had to get off. So you left work last night about 9 o'clock?
Right, about 9 o'clock.
The names of 5 men living near the victim's condominium complex came up with prior arrest and fingerprint records. One of these men was Eric Hayden, who lived in the apartment above the victims. When Hayden drove into the condominium parking lot, the detectives were waiting to speak with him.
Well, let's wait until he brings... I looked over at the driver, who was a white male in his late 20s, and I noticed that he was smoking a cigarette, and he was looking over at us with his eyes, but yet his head remained facing straight ahead. I thought this was kind of suspicious.
Hayden strolled past the officers without acknowledging them and disappeared into his condominium.
We waited a few minutes, and we wanted to see if he would return outside, which he did. He walked back down the stairs and again walked past us, not looking over at us, and was walking directly towards his car. It was at that time I approached him and I said, "Excuse me, are you Eric Hayden?" He said, "Yes, I am." And I asked him if I could ask him a few questions about that night, to which he agreed.
Hayden claimed he'd been out drinking on the night of the murder and knew nothing about it. He had noticed nothing unusual when he came home. He puffed on a cigarette as the conversation began. To the detectives, he seemed nervous. But a case of nerves would never be enough for a conviction if Hayden was the killer. The police still needed solid evidence, and pressure remained heavy on Eric Berg to provide it.
4 or 5 times.
In his lab, he fed the image of the bloody palm print through yet another computer program. This step raised the tonal values of the ridge detail, much like adjusting the contrast on a television screen. Finally, using all his software and expertise, he produced an image clear enough for comparison with the prints of any suspects. Police asked Warwick to check the prints of the 5 men with criminal records who lived near the condo complex, and that included the prints of Eric Hayden.
They gave us the name of Eric Hayden, and we checked our file, and we had some prints of his on file in our agency. So we pulled those for comparison. Well, once you're looking at the comparison and you're making the positive opinion of a match, as a lay examiner, there's that short period of time when you're the only one who knows. You know, the detectives don't know, no one knows. And then so it gives you a real sense of accomplishment.
On May 31st, Pat Warwick called the detectives and told them he had made a positive match. The prints on the bedsheet did indeed match the prints of Eric Hayden. That same night, the Kirkland detectives went to Hayden's condominium to execute a search warrant.
Open the door.
Eric Hayden, we have a warrant for your arrest. Lay down, face down on the deck.
On the floor.
Hayden was handcuffed and arrested.
What's going on? Ma'am?
His apartment was searched top to bottom, and his girlfriend was questioned.
Ma'am, I'm Detective Plum.
He was charged with first-degree murder.
The arrest of Eric Hayden.
After Hayden's arrest, police began to piece together a picture of the gruesome events of May 12, 1995. They speculated that Eric Hayden had gained entry to the victim's home, probably through some false pretense. A brutal assault and murder followed shortly thereafter. At some point, Hayden lingered over his victim, enjoying a cigarette. He placed it on the night table and covered the victim with a sheet. He then wiped his bloody hands on the sheet. As he left the scene, one of the victim's slippers jammed in the door, propping it open. It had been the open door that first attracted attention to the crime scene. Though the suspect was in custody and evidence strongly linked him to the crime, Detective Klomp's case was not airtight. Hayden's lawyers asserted that the digital technology was too new to be relied upon at the trial. They argued that the enhanced images might have been altered or tampered with. Any new forensic technology undergoes intense legal and scientific scrutiny.
Hold it right there.
Hundreds of cases have been lost through improper evidence handling procedures. At the heart of the defense team's argument was their view that a virtual image might falsely incriminate a very real and innocent man.
Some amino black on it.
Had Hayden's attorneys been successful in this challenge, losing those prints as evidence would have seriously damaged the prosecution's case. But Eric Berg took extra care to explain the process to the members of the jury and to let them decide for themselves.
We took this into court, we took the equipment with us, we set it up, we took the sheet that we originally received from King County, and we actually captured the image in court, brought it into the computer, performed all of the steps that we had done, and printed out the image, and we were able to show the jury that everything we did there is the same as what we did before, and the result is the same, and it's repeatable.
Satisfied that Berg's digital enhancement techniques were sound, credible, repeatable, and damning, the jury needed only 3 hours to return their verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree.
This technology was incredible. It helped us solve the case much faster than we would have been able to having just gone out and contacting people or waiting for additional information to come in. This left no doubt in anyone's mind that this was the killer. It positively identified the killer.
Those prints, which had seemed to be just smudges at first, had finally yielded their secrets to the new digital imaging technology. Ultimately, they betrayed Eric Hayden to justice. Hayden left behind his handprint, thinking it was an illegible smudge. He didn't know that computer enhancement could turn that faint residue into a clear picture of guilt. Other criminals take greater pains to conceal the traces of their crimes, but the remnants of murder aren't so easy to hide. Forensics has ways of flushing them out. On a frigid January morning in 1987, a fur trapper was checking his traps in the blizzard-bound Cactus Flats region of California's Big Bear. It was hard going in such miserable weather. At about 11 that morning, he noticed a large oblong object covered in the new blanket of snow. There in the wilderness lay an abandoned mattress. The strange find seemed innocuous enough, but as the trapper checked around it, he made a macabre discovery. He hurried to the nearest telephone and summoned the police. Homicide Sergeant Gary Stroop of the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department responded to the call.
When we got there, it was just starting to snow again, and it's probably about 18 degrees. So we were trying to do the scene as fast as we could so we could get out of there before we got stranded.
Beneath the mattress lay two bodies, a man and a woman, both murdered. Stroop found that in one way the weather had worked in his favor. The cold had protected the bodies against decomposition. He was also fortunate to find the bodies intact.
Check down there, see if there's anything.
There's a lot of animal activity up there. There's bears, mountain lions, coyotes, you name it. Had the weather been warmer, we probably would have had animal activity on the bodies.
Footprints, anything?
But who were the victims? Who had taken their lives?
I'll tell you one thing.
The only clues at the scene were the victims and the mattress. The man had some distinctive tattoos that resembled the kind worn by convicts.
I see blood down there.
The detectives tried to identify him by checking prison records.
Homicide, Sergeant Stroop.
Sergeant Stroop's hunch about the tattoos paid off. The fingerprints taken from the man matched those of an ex-convict named Richard Crisson. The woman was identified as his girlfriend, Shanna Thole. Autopsy evidence showed that both victims had died of multiple shotgun blasts. Through prison records, detectives were able to locate and question Richard Crisson's family. Crisson's brother told police that Richard and Shanna had gone to Victorville to see a man by the name of Archie Woods.
Richie and Shanna. Yeah, Officer Barnes, I called you earlier.
According to the brother, Crisson dealt drugs for Woods, who was a motorcycle gang member. This information, along with a background check of Woods, made him the detective's prime suspect. The police paid a visit to Archie Woods. His house lay in a secluded area 20 miles from where the victims were found. Woods wasn't at home. The detectives were greeted by Archie's girlfriend, Sherry Mills. She told the officers she didn't know where he was, but reluctantly agreed to let them in. Even before they entered Archie Woods' home, a possible clue caught their eye. On the front porch, beside the door, they found two spots that appeared to be blood. The stains could have been nothing, or they could have been the clue that would break the case wide open. It was too soon to tell. The detectives hoped to find the answer inside. Police investigating the deaths of Richard Crisson and Shanna Thole chased the only lead they had. At the home of drug dealer Archie Woods, they sought any clues they could find.
What time did Richard and Shauna leave? Still awake?
The detectives informed Woods' girlfriend, Sherry Mills, that they were told Shanna and Richard had visited the house.
You had some friends over?
Mills admitted that Crisson and Thole had indeed been there, but only to spend the night on their way somewhere else.
Yeah, so who was it last
She
night?
had no idea of their destination.
Well, it was our friend Rich and
Inside the house, detectives saw more brown spots that resembled blood. The house smelled of fresh paint. In the back bedroom, they found several paint cans. There was no sign of a mattress. If the murders occurred in this bedroom, police suspected that the paint covered crucial evidence. Police needed a way to see beneath it to look for evidence of a murder. It was the only way they could connect the homicides to this potential crime scene. They ordered a search warrant and then notified the crime scene unit that they had a difficult problem to solve. In the yard, officers noticed several wide, low-profile tire tracks, consistent with those made by a sports car. The woman victim, Shanna Thole, was last seen driving her high-performance sports car. The obvious bloodstains were examined, and the visible evidence was collected. Even so, the police were stymied. If the blood found at the house matched Thole and Crisson's, it could be explained as coming from a fistfight. There was not enough blood in plain sight to prove murder with a shotgun. It seemed as though the entire investigation had literally hit a wall. Forensic expert David Stockwell of the Sheriff's Scientific Investigation Division thought an alternative light source might reveal evidence hidden behind the paint in Wood's house. The alternate light source, or ALS, is a variable intensity laser beam typically used to highlight body fluid evidence on clothing or at a crime scene. Various fluids reflect specific frequencies of light. By adjusting the frequency of the laser, invisible evidence can be seen. Forensic technicians use tinted goggles and reflection-enhancing chemicals to make trace body fluids glow under the laser beam. Here, simulated bloody footprints become too faint to see with the naked eye. But with the right chemicals sprayed on them, and with the laser of the ALS set at the proper frequency, they fluoresce. In theory, at least, blood evidence could be made to glow, even from behind a coat of paint. But it would take the precise combination of chemicals, goggle tints, and laser frequencies to penetrate the painted layer.
The ALS is very good at picking up certain biological fluids, such as semen, but is not typically used to find blood because blood in itself is usually visible to the naked eye. What we were doing with the ALS was to see through that opaque layer of paint to see underneath it and what was there.
But would it work in such an unorthodox application at the home of Archie Woods? Police in San Bernardino had never used an ALS in this manner before. It was not built to illuminate an entire wall. They had to slowly comb small areas, hoping that the light could see through the paint and reveal any evidence beneath.
Okay, Richard, take your goggles off.
Little by little, they succeeded. With the ALS, the grim events at the Woods house were brought to light. There on the wall, beneath the fresh paint, was a wide splash pattern of darkened blood that had been all but invisible to the naked eye. This was the breakthrough police hoped for. They could now read the stain patterns on the wall to determine what happened. As shown here with this colored fluid, blood shed in violence can behave in several ways. It can drip, making a circular spot. Its diameter depends on how far and how much of the blood has fallen. It can form a series of streaks when flung off an object, such as a knife slashing through the air. This is called casting off. But another, equally telling kind of bloodstain appeared on Archie Wood's wall.
The largest of all bloodstains that I've ever seen at crime scenes are produced by what is called arterial spurting. And in this case, what I was seeing underneath the paint on the wall was in fact the bloodstain size consistent with arterial spurting.
The spurting patterns on the wall were consistent with the location of the wounds found on Crisson and Thole. The ALS painted a grim picture of their violent death. The next problem was how to preserve the bloodstains for use as evidence in court. Without proof positive of arterial spurting, a shrewd defense team might claim that only a fistfight had taken place in that room, not a murder, and certainly not two murders. The ALS had illuminated the evidence bit by bit, but now the laser had to shine on the entire wall in order to take a photograph.
Hey, George, look around. Richard. Why do I call you George?
Investigators used a technique called painting with light.
Okay.
While the camera shutter was held open, the ALS was shown on the wall from left to right and top to bottom until the entire wall had been recorded through the course of several minutes. When the negatives were developed, they provided a clear, admissible picture of what the ALS revealed. That was good news for Sergeant Stroop.
With the pattern that we had on that wall with the use of the laser, it was obvious it was high velocity and a large amount of it, much more so than you'd ever have gotten from somebody with a bloody nose or getting beat up.
The evidence of violent death in that fateful room was mounting. The exposed blood patterns revealed that at the time they were shot, Shanna Thole and Richard Crisson were lying in the bed, presenting no potential threat to their assailant. Meanwhile, their alleged killer was still at large.
That's what I was saying.
Okay, fine.
In San Bernardino, the search for Archie Woods, suspected of killing Richard Crisson and Shanna Thole, took on new urgency. To avoid being implicated in the killings, Wood's girlfriend cooperated with authorities.
No, he left a little bit later.
She disclosed to the detectives that Archie was in Modesto, visiting his little girl on her birthday.
So Richard and Shauna were already gone by the time he...
On Friday, the day Detective Stroop was gathering evidence at Archie's home, Archie himself was already under arrest in a neighboring county for carrying a concealed weapon in his car. He was driving a sports car at the time. Shanna Thole's sports car. From his cell in the San Bernardino jail, Woods maintained his innocence in the double homicide. He claimed that the murders were committed by members of his motorcycle gang. According to Woods, on the night of the murder, gang members asked Woods to lure Richard Crisson to his home. Woods claimed that after Crisson and Thole had arrived, he left his house as the gang instructed. Woods refused to identify the gang members involved.
Archie stuck with his story that he did not know who the other people were that had come into the house, that they were alive when he left and dead when he came back. But he would not ever give up the names of the other individuals that were involved.
Archie Woods said that he had then panicked and dumped the bodies in Big Bear. But with the help of the ALS, the police discovered the crucial piece of trace blood evidence that shot holes in Archie's story. The reclined position of the victims, as indicated by the bloodstains on the wall, just didn't add up to a violent confrontation. Detectives pieced together a likely scenario for the events of that night. Chrisson and Thole had come to Archie's home to settle a dispute over a drug deal gone wrong. There was a long night of discussion and argument.
We gotta do something. I mean, he's got all this stuff, right?
Apparently, the disagreement was not resolved to Archie's satisfaction. But he let Chrisson and Thole think an accord had been reached. The couple went to bed, unaware of the heavy price that Archie planned to exact from them that night. Police believe that when he thought they were sound asleep, Woods struck his helpless victims, taking their lives with blast after blast from a shotgun. Woods' one true statement was that he had dumped the bodies and the blood-soaked bedding in Big Bear, thinking no one would ever find them. Back at his house, he had first tried to clean the wall, but the blood wouldn't come off. He then covered the evidence with a thick coat of paint. But the alternate light source defied his efforts to conceal his crime. It clearly showed the pattern of the bloodstains through the opaque coat.
You know, when looking at that, there's no doubt in my mind they were killed here. They were in this bed. And, you know, that's going to show everybody, you know, what we know, or help us prove what we know, or convince a jury of what we know. And it did.
Archie Woods was given 2 life sentences for the double murder of Richard Chrisson and Shanna Thole. Every criminal leaves evidence behind. The key is to know how to find it. But the most compelling evidence is also the least tangible. It's the criminal's knowledge of his actions. A new technique is testing a way of tapping the suspect's mind to turn a criminal's own memory against him. Larry Farwell is the director and chief scientist of the Human Brain Research Laboratory in Fairfield, Iowa. He has developed a new computerized system known as brain fingerprinting. It reads the memory centers of the human brain. He believes that brain fingerprinting will one day be used to positively link perpetrators to their crimes.
Brain fingerprinting is a scientific method of determining whether certain information is stored in a brain or is not stored in the brain. If an individual has committed a crime, he'll have certain information relevant to that crime stored in his brain. So we can use brain fingerprinting to determine scientifically whether he committed the crime or not.
When someone commits a crime, his brain records it as a memory. Brain fingerprinting seeks to reveal that memory by showing the suspect evidence taken from the crime scene.
Now I'm going to be putting this headband on your head.
A headband with sensors is placed on the subject. A series of pictures or words is flashed on the screen. The computer records the brain waves produced in response to what the subject sees. The responses are recorded as a waveform. By analyzing the pattern of waves, Farwell can determine if the subject is recognizing what he's seeing.
So when you have a situation where a crime has been committed there are certain details about the crime that only the criminal would know, then you can test, does this brain have those details stored in it? If so, then the individual committed the crime. If not, then not.
The FBI is at the forefront of developing and evaluating new technology. After hearing of Farwell's system, they put it to the test. The FBI tested brain fingerprinting on their own agents at the Bureau's training facility at Quantico, Virginia.
We conducted a study on FBI agents, and the purpose of this study was to see if we could determine whether an individual is an FBI agent or not based on his or her brainwaves. If we can determine an FBI agent, then we could determine whether somebody is an agent of some, say, foreign intelligence organization or a criminal group, just based on their brain responses.
Each subject was presented with a series of words on a computer screen. Many were FBI acronyms or terms familiar only to agents. The FBI agents were specifically told to do everything they could to conceal from Farwell that they were in any way connected with the Bureau. The participants' brain response to each stimulus was measured by electrodes on a headband. The electrodes were wired to the brainwave analysis software of Farwell's system.
So what we did is to present stimuli, phrases, that only an FBI agent, because of their training, would know, mixed in with others. The FBI agents recognized them. We picked up the brain responses. We knew that they were FBI agents.
The principle behind the brain fingerprinting system is very simple. Farwell has discovered that the memory centers of the human brain respond to the sight of familiar stimuli with the distinct change in electrical activity. He calls this change a murmur.
And that is the specific brain response that we measure, that we analyze with a computer, in order to determine whether an individual recognizes the words or pictures that we flashed on the screen that are relevant to the crime or to whatever it is that we're investigating.
When the subject sees anything on the screen, it creates a pattern of brain activity. A murmur is increased brain activity produced when the subject recognizes what he's seeing.
This headband will measure the electrobrain
The test participants who did not work for the FBI did not recognize the specific FBI stimuli, so no murmurs were detected.
Some of them relevant to the FBI and some of them not.
Researchers with the United States Navy also heard the claims made about the system. They devised a test of their own to see if brain fingerprinting could distinguish military medical students from civilians. They used a list of acronyms specific to medicine and the military. Lieutenant Commander Rene Hernandez conducted the test.
The test was 100% accurate. They were able to tell each and every one. The trick with this is not so much if the technique works properly. The trick is if you ask the right questions. Because if they had not come up with a group of really good acronyms that only the students would know, then they wouldn't be able to determine the difference between the medical students and the staff, for example. So the trick is in being clever enough to ask the correct questions, because the brain will always answer it honestly.
Careful preparation of the words or pictures for a session is vital for accurate, useful results. The questions must be phrased in such a way that when a murmur occurs, it is clear why. In a murder investigation, both a witness to a shooting and the shooter might show a murmur when confronted with the murder weapon.
You have two people, only one person actually committed the crime. You have another person who simply saw it. They have the same information in their brain, so you have to get that, you have to ask the questions properly.
Rigorously constructed lab tests are one thing, but how would the brain fingerprinting system work on the front lines of a murder investigation? Could Dr. Farwell's computer read the mind of an actual killer? Like a page torn from a science fiction novel, brain fingerprinting might be the next century's most powerful new forensic tool. no criminal's secrets would be safe when his own brainwaves could bring him to justice. Captain Blaine Corral, commander of the Investigations Division of the Alexandria, Virginia Police, has also tested the system. Though he was initially skeptical about its use in the real world, he was quickly won over.
The vision I had was like of the Three Stooges with a salad bowl sitting on the top of someone's head with wires coming out of it. And I thought, not only would this technique or this technology never really be useful, but there's no way in the world it would ever be accepted by the law enforcement community.
Corral compared brain fingerprinting with the polygraph, the lie detector used by law enforcement for many years. The polygraph is still not admissible in court, but has become a standard tool to guide police.
The polygraph works on the theory that you can't control your heart rate or something called your galvanic skin response or your breathing patterns. The brain fingerprinting sort of takes that a step further and recognizes the fact that you can't control the electrical activity in your brain.
A polygraph registers only stress or emotional responses, such as heart and respiration rates and sweating. By analyzing the readings, the operator tries to discern whether a subject is being truthful or deceptive in his answers. But in some cases, the polygraph can be fooled. Brain fingerprinting is often more general. It can identify the presence of hidden information in persons fraudulently claiming either knowledge or ignorance of certain facts. But again, it reveals only the presence of the information, not the details.
So they're going to both help us toward the same end, which is ultimately to find out the truth about what we're investigating and formulate the best case for presentation in court, but they're going to sort of attack it from different angles. Both can be very crucial to a successful case.
Serious questions remain about the wholesale application of Dr. Farwell's invention. Would a murmur be revealed if a killer were in a drunken blackout or a psychotic state when he took his victim's life? In such cases, there might not be a brain fingerprint after the fact. What if right after he committed the crime, the killer received a severe head trauma?
But that's what actually happened with the person who was the bodyguard who was in the car with Princess Diana. Everybody thinks he's trying to cover up something. He had such a severe traumatic injury, he probably will never remember that because the brain never was healthy enough to store that information into long-term memory.
In most cases, brain fingerprinting a witness or an accomplice can reveal knowledge of all kinds of crime, from espionage to terrorist plots. At least that's the promise of this technology. Brain fingerprinting is not yet admissible in the United States, but it might be only a matter of time before it becomes a routine tool. The relatively new technique of DNA profiling is known to be so dead-on accurate that genetic evidence is readily accepted. Ultimately, scientists and criminal investigators agree that brain fingerprinting shows great potential in murder investigations. In a shooting death with no witnesses, the killer would be the only person with intimate knowledge of the crime. With Dr. Farwell's computer, the murderer's own brain could become a witness for the prosecution. Technology is providing new ways to reveal evidence that would have been lost or unavailable just a few years ago. Today, investigators can peer beneath paint, lift a smudged palm print from a bedsheet, and perhaps even tap into a suspect's memory to find the truth. There may be no way to completely stop crime, but forensic science is finding ever more ingenious tactics to catch criminals.